Ladies and gentlemen, on this side of the ring we have Framelocks. On this side of the ring we have Linerlocks. It is a head-to-head battle. Which one will reign supreme? We are talking about Framelocks versus Linerlocks today. Thank you for joining me on Edge Mindset. My name is Carter. I am your host here on this channel. Appreciate you hanging out with me. Like, subscribe, follow, all that crap, because why not? Yeah, why not? I got to do a shameless plug. That intro is a little bit wild. So let's be clear here. In my opinion, there is no clear winner. I'll TLDR. If you're looking for me to say Framelocks are better, Linerlocks are better, not really going to be the case. In my opinion, in my humble, very humble opinion, it's similar to the what steel is the best steel debate. There's not really such a thing. Right. There's pros and cons to everything. And if you want, for example, in the steel analogy, if you want really, really good edge retention, you're probably going to sacrifice corrosion resistance and vice versa. Right. It's a give and take. Now, that doesn't mean really nice steels don't exist like MagnaCut, which kind of bends the rules on some of that a little bit. But still, MagnaCut, in my opinion, is not necessarily the best at any one metric. It's just the best all-around steel that we currently have access to and can make. Same thing with Linerlocks and Framelocks. There's pros and cons to both sides. Depends on a lot of factors, which one you sway towards. For me, I like them both. I have them both. And that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons. We've got Framelocks on the left. We've got Linerlocks on the right. I'm going to run through each one. I'll tell you what it is in case you don't know what it is. A little bit of tidbits, a little bit of history, who invented it, and what I feel, this is my opinion, my channel, my opinion, what I feel the pros and cons are to them. So let's start with the Framelock side. Here we have a Sebenza. A Sebenza was designed and created by Mr. Chris Reeve, hence Chris Reeve Knives. He actually invented the Framelock. It is called the Chris Reeve Integral Framelock, I believe is the full name. He invented the concept of using the frame to lock the knife. So great contribution to the knife world. I don't think he gets enough credit for that particular thing. A lot of people are aware of Chris Reeve knives and they like them. They're kind of a legacy brand, an institutional brand. But I think there's a lot of people that don't know he invented the Framelock on folding knives. So yeah, very, very cool. And here we have Hinderer, who also invented something very, very cool in the Framelock world, and that is the Hinderer lock bar stabilizer, which you can't really see that well on this because it's underneath the clip there. But he invented this little disc here. It's the same disc that you're going to see on like Striders specifically. And this prevents over travel of the lock bar, so you can't accidentally overbend the lock bar in case you're in a high stress situation, which is why he invented it. I believe he was a firefighter. And so, his concern was if you're fighting a fire, adrenaline's running, you go to open up your knife and you just over push it, right? The intensity is so high, you over push it, you bend out that lock bar, and now all of a sudden your knife won't lock, right? It's a pretty big deal. It also prevents the lock bar from flexing inward as well, which is why it's not just an over-travel disc. It's a stabilizer, lock bar stabilizer. Prevents it this way as well as inward. Now, originally, when Strider first started using these, it was actually stamped Hinderer as an homage, or I don't know if that was a legal thing or if they just wanted to give him, the kudos for inventing it, but it used to be stamped with Hinderer because he invented it. So two people pivotal to the knife community that invented things that are very commonly used. Now, we've kind of moved away from stabilizers in quote-unquote modern knives, and we now incorporate it into the lock bar insert to prevent over travel. This one actually has both. It has the stabilizer as well as the over travel on the lock bar insert there. So now that we got that out of the way, this is an XM18 3.5, by the way. This is a Sebenza unique graphic with pyrite inlaid into the front handle here, which is very, very cool. Let's talk pros and cons. So probably the number one actual pro to a Framelock is the fact that your hands contact the locking mechanism. So as you grip the knife, as you squeeze it, you're applying extra force onto this lock here, with the hope being that if there was some sort of shock to the blade and this lock bar wanted to disengage, It's less likely to happen catastrophically because you are gripping the knife and you're preventing it from popping out. The next thing, and this is probably the most controversial, is the concept that this is actually a stronger lock, right? Now, this is a debate that's as old as time. Is the Framelock actually stronger? And, back in the day, the idea was, well, you've got much more surface area making contact, but then the counter to that is, but it still always comes down to how thin it is. This is the weak point, right? This is the point it'll break. I will say this. I have seen lots of Framelocks fail for different reasons. Being shocked on the back, spine whack tests, getting gunk in there. I have never seen in not even normal use, I've never seen even in abuse tests where the entire Framelock will break. Now, I have seen people snap Framelocks, usually when they're modifying the knife and they're trying to bend this out or bend it in, right? And they're creating a stress point here, especially if they've done it a bunch. Because a lot of times when you take these apart and you want to quote unquote pimp them, mod them, you want to flatten out and remove the spring on this so that everything's flat so you can sculpt it or anno it or stonewash it or whatever it is you're doing to it. And I have seen people snap this when they're manipulating it that way. But I've never, ever in any abuse test or use test seen somebody actually break or bend the Framelock right here or anywhere for that matter on the knife. I have seen them disengage though. So I don't think that is a concern. I do feel like the fact that you are more likely to get more contact with the tang on a Framelock does mean this is slightly better if implemented correctly. If implemented correctly and if you're actually using all that extra possible surface area. Because you can do a Framelock like a lot of Striders are. And this actually isn't even the best example. This has a lot of contact, but sometimes you do a Framelock and you're not actually contacting all that much. You're kind of hitting just one corner of one edge against that tang, and you're not really having that much contact. Whereas on the Linerlock, you can have a similar amount of contact on here. I'm going off the rails. Originally, I wanted to run through all pros and cons on one side and then move to the other, but they're kind of interconnected. And so I like using the example of the Linerlock. So when we're talking about implemented correctly, that's where things get sticky, because here's my honest to God opinion on which one is stronger. If implemented correctly, I feel the Linerlock is actually stronger than a Framelock, and I know people are freaking out and you are going to come at me in the comments, but I truly believe that. Because the genius of this locking mechanism is you have this pivot point here so that as you put pressure on this Linerlock, it's going to want to bow out this way, but it can't go that way because of the scale here. And so it creates like almost a negative pressure like this, right? See how my finger wants to push out, but it can't push out because of this scale. This doesn't have that flex. This does not flex right here. So it seems like, oh, this is so much thicker, it's better, but you're not getting that natural like bowing that you should get on a Linerlock where it's pushing outwards against that scale. And this is more likely to slip, right? That's the failures you see on Framelocks is there's so much force. This can't take any of that force. There's no flex here. So that force has to push this out of the way. So this is the failure you typically see on Framelocks, is this just kicks out and unlocks on you. Now, of course, this is lots of force, and normal circumstances, it shouldn't do that. Now, I feel that Framelocks are more forgiving, though. So I think you can, in my opinion, once again, my opinion, Framelocks, you're able to implement Framelocks less than ideal and still have them be very, very effective. Where if you implement a Linerlock less than ideal, it's almost useless. So if that makes any sense. In a perfect world, if things are done correctly, I feel the Linerlock is actually a stronger lock overall. However, Framelocks I feel are easier to kind of just do, and it gives you a little more forgiveness if you don't design it completely correctly. Okay, those are the big pros on the Linerlock. And I'm not really going to talk about aesthetics too much. Some people really like the way this looks. Some people don't. I could say having scales on both sides give it a universal, uniform appeal. That when you put scales on a Linerlock, you can have both sides match. If you did this like Mokutai, you've gotten a few more options there. On a Framelock, you're a little more limited on that, right? Because the frame can only be made of so many materials, ideally just titanium. Some people do make Framelocks out of Mokutai and things like that. The verdict is still out on whether that's a good idea or not. It can be a little more brittle, especially if you're putting zirconium in there, not the best idea. So typically titanium, that does kind of limit how you make this thing look. It also requires a little extra work to make this lock side look good. There's been a number of folders where on the show side, it looks amazing, super nice. And then they kind of phone in the lock side and it just takes the whole design down. So, take that as you will. That's a little bit more of a personal opinion on which one you think looks better. I personally do kind of like the way Linerlocks allow you to have matching scales on both sides. Okay, let's talk cons. Some of these I've already touched on. The fact that this will want to kick out if enough shock and pressure is put on this backside here, push that out. In terms of debris, this will, let's get back into pros, sorry. This, in my experience, handles debris a little bit better than a Linerlock, just because there's typically, not always, but typically you're going to have more spring pressure on a Framelock. It doesn't have to be that way, but it just seems like that's how they're designed more often than not. They put more pressure on here and they're able to put more pressure on there. Problem with the Linerlock is, because it's thin, you can only ever have so much spring to it. And it tends to be a little bit less intense of a lockup. And so if you do have debris in here, it's less likely to push that out of the way and more likely for it to obstruct its ability to lock. So I will give that to Framelocks. You can spring these a lot harder and then it allows you to manage debris. Now, doesn't mean you have to though. You can make a Framelock that has just as light of a spring as a Linerlock. In fact, hinderers are sprung pretty light. They do quite a bit of milling here to make these easy to disengage, but that can potentially cause an issue if you get debris inside of the knife. Now, another con with Framelocks is expense. They're more expensive, right? This has to be made out of titanium, or it should be made out of titanium for it to be a reasonable knife. You can do this out of steel, but then you've got a really, really heavy knife. You can do this out of Mokutai or Zircotai, but not ideal. It's not the best material for this. You can get away with it, but it's not the ideal material. And those are more expensive anyways. So they are more expensive, having this big titanium slab on this side. And this was really the key to Framelocks even existing, is being able to use titanium, because it allowed the knife to be light enough to not be ridiculous, and it gave you this big, thick locking bar on this particular knife. Linerlocks, on the other hand, and this is a Chavez Blue Label, kind of their budget knife, quote unquote budget knife. This one has a stainless steel lock bar here. This one is an Emerson Com 7, I believe is the name. What does it say right there? Yep, Com 7. This one has a titanium liner right there. A lot of people don't know exactly why that choice was made. I myself don't completely know that either, but Emerson is pretty strict on wanting this lock bar to be titanium. Maybe he likes the little bit of stick that kind of happens and gives you a little bit more of a positive lockup. Not quite sure. The opposite scale, or the opposite liner, has fluctuated between being titanium and steel and then back to titanium. I'm honestly not even sure what this is on here. I could grab a magnet here. Let's see. Ooh, as I kick it out here. Yep, it looks like they are running titanium on both sides now again. But like I said, that changes quite frequently. A lot less expensive to make one of these. Even with titanium, that's very small amount of titanium needed for this particular knife. So for that reason, Linerlocks tend to be more on the budget side. Now, China is able to bring prices down quite a bit. They're able to do frame locks for way less money than historically they have been, but it's still always going to cost more than a liner lock, which is why you're going to see liner locks used on more utilitarian style knives, more knives that are for usable purposes. You're going to see that generally more frequently, whereas more pocket jewelry, not that these can't be used, it's just they cost a lot of money and people are less likely to beat them up, and they baby them typically a little bit more. So if you are coming from a utilitarian standpoint, maybe liner lock is the way to go. We talked about the strength of the lock bar, how I feel if done correctly, a liner lock is very, very strong, possibly stronger than a frame lock. By the way, this was, I'm not going to say invented, this was popularized and refined by Michael Walker, which is why it's often called the Walker liner lock. He is a very influential, pivotal custom knife maker, and he came up with this system. Now, he didn't invent the liner lock. The liner locks have been used for centuries in various knives, but he did do some very important things with it. In particularly, he did the detent ball, and not only does the detent ball allow for smoother operation because it's moving on a ball instead of grinding on the liner, it also creates the detent. Right, so he invented that. The whole knife detent thing, at least in this form, he invented that along with just having that detent ball being able to ride on this lock right here. More knives, in my opinion, have been made with the Walker liner lock than any other locking mechanism in modern times. I'm not talking very, very old stuff. And of course, slip joints are not locking knives, so those don't count. But in modern folders, the liner lock is kind of tried and true and been used a whole lot. And I really like that it's kind of coming back in favor a little bit. For a while, it was like a 4-letter word. It was frame lock or nothing. And if you had a knife with a liner lock, that meant it was a cheap piece of crap and nobody liked it. So I kind of like that liner locks are coming back in fashion a little bit. I think they're going to continue to improve. We talked on pros being able to have these scales here. Another thing I want to talk about, and this one's a little bit difficult because there's not necessarily a correct answer, simplicity. So frame locks can be implemented simpler than a liner lock. For example, this Chris Reeve Sabenza, right? The one that invented it. Very simple. Just a big slab of titanium with a cut in it, and then a relief, and then it's bent over, right? But you can also make them more complicated with a lock bar insert, over travel stop. All of those things can add more complexity to it. I would still say, generally speaking, that a frame lock is a simpler construction than a liner lock. Just because the addition of the liners means you have to have more pieces and more screws. Taking apart a liner lock, I'm sure you've done it, is always more of a task than a frame lock. Whenever I've got to take a liner lock apart, I kind of dread it a little bit. I'm like, do I really need to take that apart? And some of it depends on how it's done. For example, Emerson's can be, it's not difficult. It's just there's more work there, right? Because you've got standoffs, you've got screws going into each side, you've got a liner, you've got a scale over the top of it. And then when you put it back together, everything has to line up. All the screws have to come in. It's a little more involved than this, where you just take off the screws, lift off the top, then you immediately have access to the blade. You can take the blade out, and then you immediately have access to the opposite side. You don't have scales to talk about and other things. Now, you can make it simpler than this one. You don't need screws on both sides. It could be a one-way post, which would mimic something similar to this. But still, just the addition of the scales, especially if you're trying to modify the spring on the lock here or change out detent balls, things like that, you just have to really strip liner locks down a little bit more than a frame lock, and there's a few more pieces involved, typically more hardware at least involved typically on the liner lock. So as I said at the beginning of the video, there is not a clear winner in my opinion. I like them both for different reasons. I like the affordability of the liner lock. I like having two scales. Oh, another thing I will point out before I forget, and this is another wishy-washy thing. Not wishy-washy, I just mean it's not a clear answer. But sometimes you can run into issues with like the relief cut getting caught up on pants and things like that that can be annoying. Now, there is a solution to that, and that's putting the relief cut on the inside, but not everybody does that. Whereas on a scaled knife like this, you just don't, it's not even a concern, right? There is no lock bar in here. You're always on a flat surface, and it can be something rough like this, or it can be something smooth like carbon fiber. But either way, I like both of these knives. They are both legacy locking systems. I don't see them going anywhere anytime soon. I know there was people out there that thought things like the Shark Lock or the Ultra Lock or the Snex Lock or Axis locks would completely obliterate classic frame locks and liner locks, and that is just not the case, because there's certain things that this locking mechanism does super well with the detent ball in terms of action that you just can't really get from other locking mechanisms at this point in time. Even though they may not be the strongest and the cheapest to make, depending, I don't think these are going anywhere anytime soon. Comment down below, do you have a preference between liner lock or frame lock? I have a feeling that 95% of you are going to say frame lock or nothing. But man, let's revive these liner locks in knives, because I like them. All right, guys, catch you later. I'm out.